Hello and welcome to the LSTM In Conversation podcast series. We are joined by Frank Cottrell-Boyce. Frank is an acclaimed screenwriter, novelist, author and broadcaster, best known for works such as Millions and The Railwayman, the acclaimed film he co-wrote based on the memoir of former FEPOW Eric Lomax. He has also collaborated on projects that bring FEPOW stories to wider audiences, using his storytelling expertise to amplify voices that might have otherwise been forgotten. Frank, you helped bring Eric Lomax's story to life on screen in The Railwayman. How did that experience shape your connection to the broader FEPOW story? And what did it teach you about the importance of remembering and retelling histories like this?
Wow, that's a massive question. To start, practically, I just met Eric, and I really didn't like everybody else. I didn't know much about what happened in the Far East. I read Eric's book like the week it came out and began to work on it straight away, and it was a great joy to meet Eric. But I knew very little, and as it's clear from the story, from Eric's experience and from everything that happened, we celebrate a lot about the Second World War. I grew up at a point when we were just inundated with stuff about the Second World War. Comics were full of nasty Germans shouting "Handy Hock" and heroic British people gunning them down. We played war in the playground, but I knew nothing at all about this because, well, for the simple reason it was a defeat, wasn't it? No, we didn't, as the years have gone by, the Second World War in particular has become more and more a story about how we were victorious in a righteous conflict. So that idea that there was a defeated army in there really got shoved to one side, I think.
As a storyteller, what struck you most about how these men shared their psychological experiences, and how did it influence in how you portrayed their trauma?
Okay, so first thing, as a storyteller, this kind of story in which Eric does find some kind of reconciliation with his torturer, but does not get revenge, that is literally the hardest story in the world to tell, because the bottom line for drama is famously Chekhov's revolver. If you show a revolver in Act 1, it has to be fired by Act 3. That's the way stories work. That's the reconciliation that you get. And there are very, very few dramatic and satisfying stories of forgiveness. So I would say the two pole stars are The Prodigal Son, which is an astonishing story. And also for me, Gawain and the Green Knight, which is from the Wirral. And both of them are about, find a way of telling that story. It's a really, really difficult story to tell. A story of forgiveness is a very, very difficult story to tell. If you're asking me about the men in particular, through Eric I met a few, and I also, read and reread and reread and reread The Railwayman. And it was very, very striking that a theme that I kept coming back to was that it was the more vulnerable you were, the more likely you were to survive. I found that kind of amazing, that because the more vulnerable you were, perhaps you knew that being strong was not going to get you through this. That being cooperative, being loved, being lovable, being loyal, being a good friend, that your only way through was in others. That's in the conflict itself. And I think that's a lesson that got harder for them to learn from when they got home. Because I think when they got home, they were isolated by shame and isolated by disinterest. Disinterest. It's very hard if you've had a massive experience to communicate it to the people around you. Even if you've gone to visit your relatives and the M6 was really terrible and you've arrived late, it's very hard to press upon them just how horrible that experience was. So being able to explain that you've been a slave and starved and beaten and tortured it's just impossible. Nobody can really kind of accept that. So the only kind of people who understood what a kind of dark and twisted Narnia they'd been to was other people who'd been through that terrible wardrobe. But I think they were just quite often separated. I feel that there was an organisational solidarity there, but anecdotally, lots of them just tried to get on with life and got busy and therefore kind of lost track of each other. And each other was the only thing that was going to work out for them was each other, I think. And like quite a few, I think I got this from Eric, but it might have been from somebody else. That whole thing of like I think it must have been Eric. I don't think it's in the book, but saying that had a job, got on with life, kids grew up, left home, and then when life got quiet again after work and after kids, that experience was suddenly overwhelming. The memory of the war was suddenly overwhelming. He said, as though a clock had been ticking in the room all the time, and that you'd been able to ignore it, but now it was just you and the clock, and that everything that happened in between time felt like it was in brackets, or was pretend, and that the real experience was this thing that you'd been hiding from. So I guess that was the thing that really struck me, that it was vulnerability was strength. And it's bloody hard to tell a forgiveness story.
You've spent time with Eric Lomax's daughter Charmaine, and you've seen firsthand how the personal stories like Eric's stand in for many untold ones. What did working on the railwayman teach you about the importance of keeping these memories alive for future generations?
Well, first of all, it's a story that needs to be told and isn't being told enough. And also that whole, for me, the forgiveness theme is very important. And also the mechanics of forgiveness. I think we think of forgiveness as like a nice gesture or a mood or a strength. And actually, forgiveness is quite a business. There's a lot of stages to go through and there's a lot of work to be done. Can I talk to you a little bit about Charmaine directly then? It's this, that I knew more or less nothing about Charmaine. I think there's one sentence in The Railwayman about Charmaine, which I missed, or just discounted. And Eric is very dismissive of his family life in The Railwayman. And I've always felt uncomfortable about talking about this because Eric was alive. And my wife said, and he'd come to a kind of a narrative that allowed him to move on in life, and that narrative is The Railwayman, and it allowed him to move on in lots of ways, commercially and career-wise, and he and Patty had a great ride out of that film. They had a really good time, which I'm really proud of, that aspect of it, and pleased with. But that's his narrative, and it's not the full story. And this is the extent to which it was the full story. We were filming a sequence at St. Moden, and there was this woman on the edge of the film, a visitor to set that day. And as the screenwriter, I would always be I'm kind of more or less at a loose end, not at a loose end, but you're there in case. So I always made myself known to visitors. And she said, "I'm Charmaine, I'm Eric's daughter." And I was like, what? And I don't think I'd even kind of clocked in a proper way that she even had a daughter and that she was connected with this. Her story had been so left out. And talking to Charmaine subsequently, and like I said, I've not been comfortable about talking about this until now. That business of Eric kind of blithely saying, "I was very unhappy and very disorganized and didn't cope with stuff." Yeah, what that means is he was a dad, and he was visiting misery and chaos and disloyalty on his house. And it's wonderful for Eric that he found his way out of that in the end. But we don't talk enough about, we talk a lot about the trauma and coming out of trauma, but we don't talk enough about how the traumatized visit trauma onto the people around them. So when Nagassi and that war machine tortured Eric, the consequences were not just Eric's, and Eric's path to happiness did to some extent involve writing out the unhappiness he visited on other people. And I think that's a very tangled tale that I couldn't tell because, Eric was a real person. I couldn't kind of he found this piece, I couldn't challenge that. My wife put it beautifully. We're going back to Yeats. She said, "Tread softly because you tread on his nightmares," which is a brilliant sentence, isn't it? So you couldn't challenge that, but we don't talk enough about, it's not an individual story, this. People's war traumas and torture, it's never just about them.
So there is a scene in the film where Eric is speaking to Nagasi, and he's saying, and he asked, no one talks about it. Do you think that's still relevant today, and is that still true today?
You'd have to answer that for me. I'm not sure. I mean, certainly for that generation, for ideas of masculinity and all that, but also, as I said, this was a defeat. Everybody, the mythology around the Second World War is victory, and I think there's I know there's lots of other arenas in which people are tortured, and they're all different stories. I think there's a unique difficulty about the Far East prisoners of war because it was a defeat, and that I think that may have grown. I don't know. I'm not in touch with people enough, but it seems to me that the Second World War has become more important in Britain's image of itself as the years have gone by, to the point where it's sort of become a religion and a kind of new origin myth for Britain. The kind of weird, we stood alone against evil thing. And that seems to have kind of, as the war itself has got further away, its importance seems to have grown, and the narrative of it seems to have got much simplified, more simplified every year, I think. And it's become a kind of almost a religious, it sort of occupies the space that religion used to occupy, I think. So that must be making it harder for these guys.
Frank, a lot of wise words there from your experiences, and it's absolutely true that military history is written by the winners, not the losers. And that was a huge problem with the Far East scenario. I think there was probably a political element to it as well. The fall of Singapore was Britain's greatest military defeat to that time. It's said that Churchill wept in his bath when the news came through. So again, I think all of that compounded the returning POWs not to talk about it. That was what they were told, and it was difficult. And as well as that, there was a culture grow up. I was beginning to talk in a big way to surviving Far East POWs in the 80s and 90s, and there was a culture there of nobody wants to know, but we'll meet and have a booze once a year in Scarborough or London or whatever, and we'll never buy a Japanese car, and this, that and the other. And making that step to reconciliation was enormously difficult, and I knew Eric Lomax slightly, and it was a huge step, and a step which was not liked by some Far East POWs. There's an earlier guy, you may not have heard of, called Geoffrey Adams, who wrote a book called No Time for Geishas in the late 80s, I think it was. Now, he wasn't tortured in the same way that Eric was, but he was maltreated like all the rest were. He was on the Burma Railway and had a bad time. But he actually made attempts. He went to Japan, he met some of his guards, but he came in for a lot of criticism from the FEPOW community when he returned. So, yeah, a difficult step to take.
Yeah, I mean, that's maybe something I should have said. I mean, very, very aware of that Eric was out on a limb. That, when we're talking about the difficulties, a lot of the difficulties were from other Far East prisoners of war who didn't want anyone to make that move. Never. The headed notepaper was never forgive, never forget. And that Eric was setting out precisely to do that. Eventually, when he got to that point himself. Yeah, 100%. It's also like, in terms of popular culture as well, the one image we've got of it is the bridge on the River Kwai, which is completely. I mean, how inaccurate it is, but in terms of the look of it as well, that Eric used to say, I can't, they look so well. Those guys in that film, they look fantastic, and we were starving skeletons. The only kind of accurate stuff I ever saw about it before I got involved was Ronald Searle's amazing drawings, and in a way, one of the maybe this is for another time, but one of the few cultural images of what it was like in Changi, if not on the railway, is St. Trinian's. That idea of complete anarchy, everything unpredictable, no stability. That the St. Trinian's thing is that's Ronald Searle writing about Changi, and the terrible thing for him was that the success of St. Trinian's felt like a prison to him, you know, and so he was trying to get his revenge, and it got him back. I think that's a very interesting area to think about. I know it's completely different. So I think the cell thing is interesting because it's like no amount of success is going to make up for what's happened to you. You know, it will still come and get you if you don't work it through. I think that's the thing. And so he was kind of exploiting it, and he had this fantastically romantic love affair with Kay Webb and all this stuff, and still, you know, it came and crushed him, and because success had the face of Changi for him, you know. It's great to have an opportunity to talk about it, and I'm really grateful to you for shuffling things around for me. Thank you.